In the shadowed data vaults of the Segmentum Obscurus fleet records, during the mustering of the Angevin Crusade in the early 11th century of M38, archivists unearthed a collection of degraded Mechanicus logs. Their authorship is uncertain, their coherence partial, their purpose never wholly clear. Yet the Adeptus Mechanicus named them the Koronus fragments, and from their fractured data seals flowed the first Imperial whispers of a passage through the screaming veil of the halo stars. The fragments were not codified maps or stellar charts in the manner of the Navis Nobilitae. Instead, they resembled the logbook of an explorator fleet, driven beyond its mandate, scattered by warp tumult, and piecing its memory back in static, choked recollection. They spoke of a breach in the immolating storms that girded the halo, a corridor of tolerable translation that led into a region unbound and unmeasured. Dozens of entries named worlds brimming with mineral harvest, oceans untainted by industry, and biospheres fit for human life. Yet when the Mechanicus adepts aligned the coordinates, they found no entry vector, no precise astral fix. It was as if the warp itself had obscured the trail, preserving only the testimony of those who once had walked it. What power erased that knowledge? Was it the hand of the ruinous powers, jealous of mortal ingress into their shrouded hunting grounds? Or the decree of the Omnisire, ensuring that discovery would come only at a time preordained? The fragments do not answer. They linger in half-corrupted code, mechanical voices repeating designations of worlds that never appeared on sanctioned charts, interspersed with sudden breaks, vox screams, prayer cants, silence. When these records reached the councils of the Angevin Crusade, they were not dismissed. The Lord Militant and his advisors, already preparing to scour and conquer the region that would become the Calixis sector, entered them into their war archives. To the pious zealots of the ecclesiarchy, the documents hinted at an untouched realm awaiting the Emperor's light. To the rogue trader dynasties bound to the Crusade, they suggested wealth beyond calculation, drifting just beyond the edge of sanctioned space. Tales spread among the soldiery and the Voidborn, of a hinterland glimmering with unclaimed riches, its gates barred by storms, its promise waiting for the bold. This legend, seeded in the very blood of the Crusade, survived the centuries that followed. Though the Koronus Expanse would not be formally breached until millennia later, the fragments endured as a ghost map, an invocation of a promise withheld. They were cited in the petitions of explorators, murmured in the litanies of voidfarers, and carried in the half-believed traditions of rogue traders who claimed lineage to those who first heard the tale. The Angevin Crusade forged the Calixis sector in blood and proclamation, binding worlds into imperial order. Yet even amid the triumphal processions, officers and savants traded speculation on the unmeasured territory that lay beyond. Was the Expanse a garden awaiting cultivation, or a trap where the storms themselves served as wardens? Had the original fleet perished in its own presumption, its testimony nothing more than the death throes of vessels lost forever to the Imperium? The silence of the Koronus Expanse remained unbroken, but the idea had already taken root. Men and women do not forget the lure of worlds unclaimed. In every chart hall and fleet council of the Calixis sector, the fragments whispered of a promise suspended in the warp itself, a frontier that existed in possibility, if not in fact. And so the legend was born, carried from one generation to the next, a zone of mystery, its doors glimpsed yet barred, its bounty only ever half described. Each retelling sharpened the hunger of those who would one day seek to tear the veil open. The storms raged on the Halo frontier, but behind them something stirred, waiting for the hand that dared reach. The Angevin Crusade marched with fire and ordnance, its banners carried upon tides of blood, its path carved across systems where resistance was measured in pyres. Yet beneath the proclamations of compliance and the thunder of macro cannon, the Koronus fragments travelled too, scraps of corrupted code folded into the data stacks of the Crusade, passed between savants, rogue cartographers, and officers who could not resist their allure. What was their substance? A ledger of worlds catalogued but never reached. A promise of riches set down in tones of absolute confidence, and yet denied the single cipher that would unlock them. the explorator fleet that authored the documents named worlds of staggering potential. Oceans without salinity, mineral veins uncounted, and biospheres untouched by industry. The notes speak of regions where human settlement could thrive without terraforming, where the Imperium might seed 1,000 colonies. Each entry was a spark of possibility, but each was shorn of the means to be grasped. No translation corridor, no stable coordinates, no reliable stellar fix survived the degradation of the records. The Mechanicus adepts charged with their collation found only corrupted glyphs where navigational data should have been. A map then, without a path. A vault of treasure for which the key had been dissolved in static. What does such a document become when stripped of utility? For the priesthood of Mars, it was an irritation, a half-measure unworthy of the Omnissiah's clarity. Yet for the Crusades' rogue traders, it was intoxicant. Among those dynasties bound by oath to the Angevin cause, whispers spread of worlds that could transform a fortune, systems that might anchor new dominions. Men and women of that bloodline live upon risk and gamble, and so even a rumour becomes coin. The fragments promised that beyond the storm wall lay not barren void, but a second galaxy's worth of conquests, waiting in patient silence. The Crusade soldiery carried those whispers, embroidered them, gave them flesh. Worlds of gold, oceans of oil, planets where crops grew without labour. Every retelling birthed new exaggerations, and soon the fragments were no longer degraded vox recordings, but the stuff of legend. The testimony of an age when the expanse had been reached, when the Emperor's servants had walked its fields and seen its mineral spires with their own eyes. None questioned how such explorers had vanished without return. None troubled themselves to ask how testimony survived when ships did not. The story was sufficient, and stories arm men as surely as flak plate. Yet in the quiet halls of Fleet Command, questions did arise. What force could erase coordinates so completely, leaving only the memory of abundance? Did the warp itself reject disclosure, severing the link between destination and path? Or had some higher power, an Ordo decree, a Mechanicus censure, or the hand of the Inquisition, obliterated the true data, deeming the knowledge too perilous to circulate? A crusade already aflame with zeal could not afford a distraction, and so the fragments were filed, cited, and made at once public and inaccessible. And thus their legend grew. The Angevin Crusade succeeded in the measure that history records. The Calixis sector was founded, its worlds bound to imperial tithe, its faith sealed in ministorum liturgy. Yet every triumph cast a shadow. In that shadow lingered the dream of the fragments, a persistent suggestion that the true frontier lay not in the sector's core, but just beyond its rim, where storms thundered and the halo stars flickered. Every legend grows teeth when left untended. As decades became centuries, the Expanse was no longer a nameless territory glimpsed in Apocrypha, but a half-believed destiny. For what commander, gazing on the endless storm wall at the edge of Calixis, did not wonder if a corridor lay hidden there, waiting to be claimed? The fragments did not die. They became inheritance, an heirloom of uncertainty, passed from one age of ambition to the next. And in the moor, at the storm's edge, rumour began to coil like smoke. Some claimed the path was opening. Others swore that ships had returned with holds of riches, their captains silenced by shadow orders. Always, the Expanse waited. Always, the fragments whispered. The Angevin Crusade had reshaped the void with ordinance and decree, binding stars to Terra's writ, enshrining the Calixis sector as one more bastion of imperial dominion. But the campaigns of compliance are never only war. They are also faith, policy, and the shaping of myth. And within that furnace of transformation, the Koronus fragments were not cast aside as curiosities. They became a seed of narrative, deliberately placed in the chronicles of the sector's making, so that what began as half-erased testimony could stand as sanctioned rumour. To the priests of the Ministorum, the fragments were a tale fit for pulpits. They could be cited as proof that beyond the storm wall, the Emperor had prepared realms for mankind, sanctuaries held in abeyance until the faithful were ready. The liturgies of Angevin zeal were woven with references to untouched frontiers, promised by the throne as a reward for loyalty and conquest. To the men of the guard, these words carried a different weight. After the crucible of battle, there lay open lands, verdant and unscarred, awaiting only the footfall of Imperial settlers. Such visions burnished morale, binding soldiers to the march as surely as commissarial pistols. The rogue traders, however, tasted opportunity more keenly. Their dynasties are not engines of faith, but of appetite, licensed by ancient warrant to range where Imperial fleets do not. For them, the fragments suggested not just wealth, but legacy. If one of their line could pierce the storm veil and recover what was promised in that corrupted record, they would not merely enrich themselves, they would write themselves into the Imperium's great ledger of discovery. And so the Expanse became the stuff of oaths whispered in chart rooms, of family pacts inked in blood. Thus myth became doctrine. Within the Angevin annals, references to the Koronus fragments were inscribed not as doubtful curiosa, but as a standing note, that there existed beyond the storm wall a region, rich and immense, which might one day fall into Imperial hands. Official records, duplicated across administratum repositories, ensured the survival of this suggestion across the centuries. By enshrining rumour within bureaucratic permanence, the Crusade guaranteed that the idea would never be forgotten. Yet with each retelling, exaggeration grew. The storm-girded region was no longer merely resource-rich. It was said to harbour relics of the dark age of technology, lost Eldari crystal cities, even portals to Blackstone caverns untouched since the War in Heaven. These tales were unverified, impossible to prove, yet no less potent. They multiplied because they served. They gave purpose to the restless, justification to the ambitious, and hope to the weary. But what consequences arise when legend is placed beside fact, when rumour is not dismissed but inscribed in the very record of a sector's founding? The result is expectation. By the dawn of the 39th millennium, every voidfarer in the Calixis Rim knew the tale of the Expanse. Every rogue trader dreamed of discovering the more, and every commander who gazed at the warp storms on the halo fringe did so with the quiet conviction that something vast lay hidden there, waiting. The Angevin Crusade had concluded, its victories written in blood and parchment. Yet the shadow it cast stretched further than its armies marched. The Koronus fragments, once fractured echoes in a Mechanicus archive, had become a doctrine of possibility. They had become an inheritance of hunger, lodged in the marrow of the sector. And hunger is never still. It gnaws, it whispers, it waits for the hand that dares to seize. When millennia had passed, and the Calixis sector stood firm beneath the Emperor's gaze, the Expanse remained locked beyond its storm barrier, a legend gnawing at the edge of every map. What the Angevin Crusade had seeded as doctrine endured like a splinter of prophecy, waiting for its moment. And in the opening centuries of the 41st millennium, the moment arrived. It was not the Navy, nor the explorator fleets of Mars, but a rogue trader who first forced his prow into the storm wall and returned alive. Purity Lathimon is the name that endures, though rumour insists she was not alone, and that half a dozen dynasts perished in the attempt. Her vessel, scarred and half-broken, limped back from the moor bearing proof that a corridor did exist, narrow, unstable, treacherous, but real. She named it the Moor, and in that naming, a legend of apocryphal Mechanicus fragments became a frontier of blood and ambition. From that breach poured more than vessels. Outposts rose, Port Wanda, built as lantern and watch upon the storm's threshold. Footfall, founded as haven for mercenaries, witches and traders, too wild for Imperial law. Every dynasty with warrant to range beyond the rim hurled itself at the corridor, and beyond it, into the unmeasured dark. The fragments had spoken of mineral-rich worlds, oceans fit for colonization, and Xenos ruins unnumbered. Now, piece by piece, those promises began to take substance. Worlds were charted, colonies founded, wealth carved from alien stone. But the price was terrible. Of every flotilla that entered the moor, another vanished into its vortices. Warp tides devoured hulls, demons tore through Geller fields, and Xenos empires awoke in rage at the intrusion. Winterscale, Corda, Harlock, names that would echo across centuries, rose in power upon this edge, each building their fortune from the Expanse's bounty, each shedding blood to hold their claim. And through it all, the Koronus fragments remained. Traders cited them as if they were charter. Missionaries preached that their testimony had been vindicated by providence. Explorators searched for the precise worlds once named in those broken records, convinced that in their rediscovery lay proof of the Omnissiah's hidden plan. To some, they were prophecy fulfilled. To others, a lure crafted by unknown hands to draw the Imperium into peril. Did the original fleet truly pierce the moor before its rediscovery? Or were the fragments the echo of another truth, a fleet swallowed by the warp, its dying signals degraded into illusion? We cannot know. What endures is their effect. They gave the Expanse its legend long before it was found. They sharpened ambition into hunger. And when at last Purity Lathamon's vessel staggered from the moor, the Imperium did not greet the revelation with surprise. It greeted it with recognition. The Koronus Expanse had always been there, waiting. The fragments had whispered of it for millennia. And so when its gates finally opened, it was not merely a discovery. It was the rebirth of a myth already alive in the heart of the Imperium. A myth reborn as frontier, drenched in war, sanctified in greed, sanctified in faith. Thus, the legend of the Koronus fragments endures, not as a curiosity of lost data, but as the spark that lit an empire of ambition. And in the endless night of the 41st millennium, where every star is both promise and snare, it is legend that moves men to die and to conquer.